Picture this. The marble palaces of Rome shimmer under the glow of torchlight. Behind their grandeur, whispers spread of a ruler whose desires eclipsed reason itself. This is not the Rome of triumphant legions or noble senators. It is the Rome of Caligula, where the empire's heartbeats quickened not with honor, but with fear and forbidden spectacle. In this journey, you will uncover a world of excess, betrayal, and rituals so twisted that ancient chroniclers could only hint at their darkness. What unfolded behind closed doors reshaped not only an emperor's legacy, but the very image of Rome itself. And the more you learn, the more you'll wonder. How much of it was madness and how much was power unleashed without limits? If you enjoy uncovering history's darkest truths, subscribe to Secret Historians. Like this video, leave a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from, and join a community that refuses to let history's buried shadows vanish. What you're about to hear is not just a story, it's a descent into the darkest chambers of Rome's empire. Imagine being summoned to the palace of Caligula, not as a guest, but as a pawn in rituals so perverse that whispers alone could cost you your life. The night air in Rome was heavy with incense and the faint metallic tang of blood from distant sacrifices. The torches flickered against the marble facades of temples and villas, but it was the Palatine Hill that drew every eye. At its summit, the imperial palace loomed like a predator in stone, its shadows concealing a ruler whose appetites had become legend. Citizens spoke in hushed tones, never daring to say his name too loudly, for even walls were said to have ears. They had seen emperors before, Augustus the divine founder, Tiberius the reclusive schemer, but none had prepared them for Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, better known as Caligula. He was the boy who had once been adored by soldiers, nicknamed Little Boots, for the miniature uniform he wore at his father Germanicus's side. That same boy now sat on the throne of the Roman world, draped not in innocence, but in layers of fear, cruelty, and lust. What Rome witnessed under his rule blurred the line between governance and theatre, between ritual and nightmare. When the young emperor first ascended in 37 CE, the people cheered. After the gloom and suspicion of Tiberius, Caligula's youthful energy felt like liberation. He granted bonuses to soldiers, freed those unjustly imprisoned, and staged magnificent games. For a moment, the empire believed it had found a savior, but power intoxicates, and absolute power corrodes faster than any poison. Within months, Caligula transformed from a promising heir into something Rome had never seen. A ruler who wielded his authority like a blade, cutting into every sacred boundary of Roman life, political, religious, and sexual. But ask yourself this: how does a beloved young emperor, adored by the masses, turn into a figure whispered about with dread? What twisted path takes a ruler from hopeful beginnings into the abyss of rituals that still chill the spine nearly 2,000 years later? Caligula's descent has long been debated. Ancient sources suggest a grave illness struck him early in his reign, leaving his mind fractured. Suetonius claims that after recovering, Caligula believed himself more than mortal, demanding worship as a living god. Others argue that the seeds of madness were always within him, nurtured by Rome's endless intrigues and betrayals. Whatever the cause, his palace soon became less a seat of government and more a labyrinth of fear, spectacle, and unspeakable acts. The emperor blurred the sacred and the profane. Temples were no longer solely for Rome's gods. They became stages for Caligula's own divinity. He reportedly dressed as Jupiter, Venus, or Apollo, forcing senators and priests to bow before his shifting personas. But behind these performances lurked darker compulsions. Whispers told of noble women, and even brides seized from banquets, dragged into chambers, and returned disheveled while their husbands trembled in silence. Imagine being a senator invited to dinner. The tables groan under exotic delicacies, peacock tongues, flamingo brains, honey-drenched dormice. Yet no feast could mask the tension. For at any moment the emperor might rise, point to your wife, your sister, even your mother, and claim her as his own for the night. Refusal was unthinkable. Resistance meant ruin. And so Rome's elite sat in paralyzed silence, watching as the boundaries of family, honor, and dignity were shattered before their eyes. Caligula reveled in this power. To him it was not merely indulgence, it was domination. To break Rome's proudest men by violating what they held sacred was the purest expression of his supremacy. It was not enough to rule their bodies in the Senate. He would rule their private lives, their bedrooms, their very bloodlines. Picture yourself there, seated at that gilded table, knowing that at any moment your life, your family, your honor could be stripped away with a single gesture. Would you dare meet the emperor's gaze? Or would you lower your eyes, praying he passed you by? The stories grew more grotesque. Some chroniclers alleged that Caligula indulged in incest with his sisters, Drusilla, Julia Livilla, and Agrippina the Younger, using them as pawns in his twisted theater of power. Ancient writers may have exaggerated, but even the whispers served their purpose. They cemented his reputation as a ruler who recognized no boundary, divine or human. When Drusilla died, Caligula reportedly wept as though Rome itself had collapsed. He declared her a goddess, demanding worship in her honor. Was this grief, love, or a darker obsession? Historians still debate, but the message was clear. In Caligula's Rome, family ties, religion, and decency all bent under the weight of his will. The emperor's nightly revels became legendary. He is said to have turned parts of the palace into brothels, where senators' wives and Rome's most distinguished women were compelled to serve. Money flowed in, but wealth was not the goal. It was humiliation, the demonstration that no one, not even Rome's nobility, stood beyond his reach. The city itself seemed to pulse with dread. To walk past the Palatine at night was to hear muffled cries, bursts of laughter, and the clatter of feasts that felt more like sacrificial rites than celebrations. Citizens kept their eyes down, whispering only in the safety of shadows. For in Rome, rumor could kill, but silence could not save you either. And you, yes you, if summoned to that palace, what choice would you have? To refuse was death, to submit was survival. But survival came at a cost that lingered long after the torches burned out. One infamous episode recounted by Suetonius describes Caligula attending a wedding. As vows were exchanged, the emperor interrupted, declaring the bride too beautiful to belong to anyone else. He seized her on the spot, bedding her before the horrified guests, then returning her as if nothing had happened. To Caligula, this was not cruelty. It was theater, a demonstration that no law, no ritual, no vow could restrain him. Even Rome's sacred Vestal virgins, sworn to chastity upon pain of death, were rumored to have been drawn into his web. Whether true or exaggerated, such tales reveal the depth of fear that surrounded him. For to suggest that Caligula desecrated Rome's holiest women was to admit that no part of society remained untouched by his excess. Night after night, the palace pulsed with a fever that gripped the empire. There were feasts where animals were slaughtered not for sacrifice but for spectacle. There were performances where Caligula himself danced or sang, forcing senators to applaud under threat of execution. And there were rituals, dark, whispered, half forgotten, where desire and terror became indistinguishable. Ask yourself this: was Caligula a madman spiraling into depravity, or a master manipulator who used shock and fear as the ultimate weapon of control? The truth may lie somewhere in between, hidden in the smoke and torchlight of his forbidden rituals. By the time the first year of his reign had passed, the Rome that once celebrated his rise now trembled at his name. Senators plotted in silence, soldiers muttered behind their helmets, and even the common people who once adored little boots avoided his gaze in processions. Yet none dared move against him, not yet. His power was absolute and his appetites insatiable. The palace walls, however, could not contain the whispers forever. Stories seeped into the streets, of women stolen from their beds, of noblemen humiliated, of rituals where bodies became offerings to the emperor's twisted imagination. Each tale fed Rome's unease, each rumor adding to the legend of an emperor who seemed less a man than a force of chaos. And so the empire watched, horrified yet transfixed, as Caligula pushed boundary after boundary, but no one could predict how far he would go, or how long Rome could endure the darkness that had descended on its throne. The torches of the Palatine still burned, their glow casting long shadows across the city. Somewhere inside, another feast began, another ritual unfolded, and outside in the silence of the streets, Rome held its breath, because everyone knew the worst was yet to come. The marble corridors of the Palatine Palace echoed with footsteps that were never meant to be heard. Servants moved like shadows, careful never to look directly at the emperor. for even a glance could be interpreted as defiance. Those who worked within these halls lived with a constant awareness that survival depended not on loyalty, but on silence. Every whisper carried risk, yet silence was its own form of complicity. In those days, the palace itself seemed alive, its walls absorbing secrets too dangerous for daylight. Rome's senators, once the proud voice of a republic, now found themselves as little more than actors in Caligula's theatre. They were summoned to meetings that blurred the line between political ritual and personal humiliation. The emperor often entered dressed as a god, sometimes Jupiter with thunderbolts, sometimes Venus in flowing silk. Senators were forced to applaud, to kneel, to pretend that this masquerade was divine truth. Imagine the weight of centuries of Roman tradition, disciplined fathers, stern generals, keepers of the law, now reduced to trembling before a man draped in costumes and madness. And yet, the danger was not confined to these performances. Behind closed doors, the rituals of the night unfolded with even greater cruelty. Guests at imperial banquets could never be sure if they were attendees or victims. It was not uncommon for the emperor to rise mid-feast, his eyes settling on a noblewoman, perhaps seated beside her husband. With a smirk, he would beckon her to follow, vanishing into private chambers. Minutes later, she would return disheveled, the table silent in its shame. Husbands stared at their plates, unwilling to acknowledge what had just transpired, knowing their silence was the only shield they had. Now imagine yourself in that moment. You sit among Rome's elite, the taste of wine turning sour in your mouth as Caligula scans the table. Every heartbeat is a drum of fear. Will his eyes stop on you, on your family, on the person you swore to protect? There is no escape, no protest, no plea that could sway him. You are both participant and prisoner, bound by invisible chains stronger than any iron. The emperor's cruelty was not random. It was deliberate, a performance designed to remind Rome's most powerful men that their power was an illusion. He destroyed their pride not by killing them, but by forcing them to live with humiliation. Ancient chroniclers describe these feasts as spectacles, where virtue was mocked, where sacred vows were broken, and where the emperor's laughter echoed louder than any prayer. Suetonius claimed that Caligula delighted in asking his guests afterward whether they had enjoyed themselves, daring them to admit their suffering. Rumors swirled that his sisters, Drusilla, Julia Livilla, and Agrippina, were not spared from his appetites. Whether truth or slander, the suggestion alone was enough to stain the imperial name. Drusilla, in particular, became central to his legend. Some accounts suggest she was treated not merely as a sister, but as a consort. When she died suddenly, Caligula's grief was unlike anything Rome had seen. He declared a period of public mourning, forbidding laughter or festivals. More shockingly, he had her deified, naming her Diva Drusilla and demanding temples in her honor. To worship a dead sister as a goddess was blasphemy to some, but in Caligula's Rome, defiance meant death. And here you must wonder, was this grief born of love or something darker? Historians still argue. Was Caligula consumed by madness, or did he see in Drusilla the reflection of his own godlike image? The truth remains elusive, yet the shadow of their relationship haunted Rome. Whispering of boundaries shattered beyond repair. As his reign unfolded, Caligula sought ever greater ways to bend flesh and ritual to his will. He opened sections of the palace as brothels, filling them with Rome's noblest women. Senators' wives, even their daughters, were compelled to serve. Coins exchanged hands, but wealth was never the purpose. It was humiliation, the reminder that even the most respected families existed at his pleasure. Rome's nobility, once the guardians of tradition, were forced into roles that mocked everything they once defended. Now imagine walking past the Palatine Hill at night. You hear muffled laughter, the clinking of goblets, the cries of women hidden behind marble walls. Do you quicken your pace, eyes fixed on the ground? Do you cross yourself, whispering a prayer to Jupiter for protection? Or do you simply remain silent, knowing that silence is the only safety left in a city ruled by fear? Even the holiest institutions were not beyond his reach. Whispers claim that Vestal virgins, Rome's sacred guardians of the eternal flame, were desecrated. Whether myth or reality, the very possibility was enough to terrify the populace. For if the emperor could touch what was most sacred, what remained untouchable? To Rome's people, the answer was clear: nothing. Caligula's rituals grew darker still. There were tales of feasts where animals were slaughtered in the dining halls, blood pooling on marble floors as guests were forced to watch. Other nights saw the emperor performing as an actor or dancer, compelling senators to cheer as if their lives depended on it. Because they did. Every clap, every cheer was survival, and yet every cheer was also another nail in Rome's dignity. Think of the psychological torment. You are forced to praise the very man who destroys you, to applaud, to smile, to nod, all while your soul screams for escape. That is the kind of power Caligula wielded, not just over bodies, but over minds. He reshaped reality itself, making truth irrelevant, leaving only fear. But perhaps the most chilling part of these stories is the uncertainty. Ancient sources often contradict each other. Some may have exaggerated to justify his assassination later. Yet the consistency of the themes, humiliation, excess, desecration, suggests a reign so horrifying that exaggeration was unnecessary. What kind of man must he have been for even rumor to feel believable? Rome itself seemed to pulse with unease. Streets were quieter, citizens more guarded. To be overheard speaking ill of the emperor was a death sentence, yet to praise him too loudly invited suspicion. The empire had become a stage, and every Roman a reluctant actor in Caligula's play. And you, had you lived then, would have been part of this performance. Would you have risked speaking out, knowing your family could be destroyed overnight? Or would you have bowed your head, convincing yourself that survival was worth the silence? These are the choices Caligula forced upon an entire civilization. His reign was still young, and yet already the city quaked under his shadow. Each night brought new rumors, each day new humiliations. The emperor's madness or genius seemed limitless. And while Rome trembled, Caligula looked to the future, plotting spectacles so outrageous that even his darkest deeds so far would pale in comparison. Because deep within the palace, beyond the torchlit corridors and the perfumed chambers, plans were forming. Plans that would not only humiliate Rome's elite, but shake the very foundations of religion, politics, and empire itself. What began as whispers of scandal was about to become something even more terrifying, acts that would challenge the very gods of Rome. The night grew heavy with silence. Citizens lay awake in their homes, senators stared into the dark, wives clutched their children closer. Everyone knew that tomorrow would bring something worse, something unthinkable. For in Caligula's Rome there was no bottom to the abyss. The dawn over Rome should have brought peace, but under Caligula's rule mornings carried their own dread. Citizens awoke not with the comfort of routine, but with uncertainty. What decree, what spectacle, what humiliation would the emperor impose today? The streets bustled as always, the markets opened, the aqueducts poured water into marble basins, but beneath the familiar hum of the city was a tension that never loosened. Every voice was lowered, every gesture measured, for even the appearance of disloyalty could summon ruin. Caligula's obsessions no longer confined themselves to the palace walls. His vision stretched outward, bending Rome's religion and politics into the service of his desires. Where emperors before him had sought divine favor, Caligula declared himself divine. He did not merely demand loyalty, he demanded worship. Temples once dedicated to Jupiter or Apollo were rededicated to Caligula himself. Statues of gods were stripped and replaced with his likeness, a living god who would not wait for death to claim immortality. Imagine the shock of priests who had spent their lives tending to sacred rites. Now they bowed not before the eternal deities of Rome, but before a man whose whims changed by the hour. Some chroniclers claim he ordered his own statue placed in the Temple of Jerusalem, an act so sacrilegious it nearly sparked revolt. Whether fact or exaggeration, the story reveals the scale of his ambition. There was no boundary, no holy ground beyond his reach. And you, if you were a priest or devotee, watching centuries of tradition collapse in the shadow of one man's ego, would you resist, knowing resistance meant death? Or would you pretend, mouth the prayers to Caligula, and hope the gods forgave your silence? The emperor's arrogance grew alongside his cruelty. He began to experiment not only with the rituals of gods, but with the very structure of Rome's politics. Senators were summoned to humiliating displays, forced to run beside his chariot or scatter gold coins to the crowds at his command. The Senate, once the foundation of Roman governance, became little more than an audience for his deranged theater. He mocked them openly, calling them cowards, stripping them of dignity with every performance. Caligula's nights, meanwhile, plunged further into excess. Chroniclers describe feasts that stretched until dawn, tables sagging under the weight of dishes so extravagant they seemed designed not to nourish, but to overwhelm. Wine flowed in rivers, dancers moved in torchlight, and behind it all the emperor watched, his moods unpredictable. At times he was jovial, laughing and handing out riches. At others he grew cold, his eyes narrowing, and a single word could mean death for anyone who displeased him. Imagine sitting there, your cup trembling in your hand, as Caligula leaned forward. His smile could mean a gift of land, or a cruel joke that ended with your humiliation before the entire court. The line between fortune and ruin was razor-thin, and every guest walked it in silence. Yet these excesses were not merely personal indulgence. They were tools of control. By destabilizing Rome's elite, by forcing them to live in constant fear, Caligula ensured their obedience. The empire was vast, its legions loyal, but its heart, the Senate, the nobility, the priests, was bound by chains of humiliation. Still, whispers spread. Not everyone could endure the constant degradation. Behind closed doors, in dimly lit villas and secluded gardens, conversations turned dangerous. Senators muttered of their ancestors, of Brutus and the knife that freed Rome from tyranny once before. Soldiers spoke in hushed tones about loyalty, about whether an emperor who mocked them could still command their respect. And the people, once so enamored with little boots, now muttered curses when the torches dimmed, but Caligula seemed immune to fear. He doubled down on his rituals of power. One story tells of him declaring his horse Incitatus a priest, and even planning to make him a consul. To the emperor this was not madness but mockery. By elevating an animal above Rome's proudest men, he revealed their impotence. What did it say about the Senate if a horse could sit among them? It was both a joke and a warning. Your power is nothing, your dignity meaningless, and here, you must pause to consider, was this the ravings of a madman, or the genius of a tyrant who understood that humiliation is more powerful than the sword? Madness and calculation often blur, and in Caligula perhaps they were one and the same. The rituals of the palace took on a darker tone still. There were reports of blood sacrifices, not to the gods, but to the emperor himself. Whether these accounts are truth or slander, they paint a picture of a man who demanded offerings not as devotion, but as entertainment. Guests were forced to watch as animals were slaughtered beside them, their cries mingling with the laughter of the court. The marble floors, once pristine, became slick with reminders that Rome's ruler no longer recognized the line between feast and sacrificial rite. Now imagine the smell, the iron tang of blood mixing with incense, the heat of torches casting trembling shadows across gilded walls, the air thick, suffocating, as senators forced smiles and lifted cups of wine to trembling lips. How long could a city, even one as mighty as Rome, endure such nights? And yet endurance was the only choice. To speak out was death. To act was suicide. So Rome's elite endured night after night, humiliation after humiliation. But endurance has its limits, and beneath the silence something darker began to grow. Rome itself reflected this unease. Ordinary citizens spoke of omens. Strange weather, sudden plagues, lightning striking temples. These were read as signs that the gods themselves had turned against Caligula. Priests whispered that Jupiter was offended, that Mars withheld his favor, that the eternal flame flickered as though gasping for breath. Superstition thrived, and in every tavern and market stall, rumors of divine wrath spread like wildfire. You can almost hear the city at night, the distant cries from the palace, the muttered prayers of the fearful, the unspoken hope that the gods would intervene where men could not. Rome was a city waiting, holding its breath, as though anticipating an inevitable reckoning. And Caligula, he seemed to revel in it. The fear, the whispers, the signs, all were fuel for his performance. He was not merely emperor. He was a god, a tormentor, a living embodiment of Rome's darkest fears. He strode through his palace draped in gold, his laughter echoing down corridors where servants trembled. To him, fear was worship, and the more Rome trembled, the more divine he became. But power built on terror is fragile. Already cracks were forming. Already whispers were growing louder. Already men who once trembled began to imagine another possibility, that Rome might yet free itself from its emperor. The torches of the Palatine flickered that night, casting shadows longer than ever before. Within those shadows, alliances were forming, thoughts turning dangerous. Rome's most powerful men, humiliated beyond endurance, began to dream of knives. The night sky above Rome burned with torchlight, but beneath its glow the empire's heart trembled. Caligula's rule had already twisted every institution of Roman life. Religion was no longer sacred, politics no longer dignified, and even family bonds were not safe from corruption. Yet as months turned into years, the emperor's demands only grew. What had begun as humiliations within the palace now spilled outward into the very fabric of Rome itself, until the entire empire felt as though it was caught in his grip. He had made himself a god. Statues bearing his likeness stood in temples, replacing Jupiter and Mars. Priests led ceremonies in his name, their lips forming prayers not to eternal deities, but to a man who walked among them. The Senate bowed, the people obeyed, and yet beneath the rituals unease festered. Rome was not blind. The emperor who once promised prosperity had become a figure of dread, and his nightly excesses became the city's darkest rumor. But Caligula was not satisfied with worship alone. He wanted spectacle. He wanted the world to see his power reflected in every corner of the empire. And so he turned to games, to festivals, to displays that blurred the line between celebration and ritual. The arenas of Rome had seen blood before, gladiators fighting to the death, animals slaughtered for entertainment, but under Caligula the spectacles took on a new cruelty. It was not enough to kill. He sought to degrade. Imagine the amphitheater filled with thousands of citizens, the roar of the crowd rising as prisoners were brought forth. Some were condemned criminals, others simply guilty of displeasing the emperor. Caligula watched from above, his eyes glittering with amusement. Instead of noble duels or heroic combat, the victims were thrown helpless to wild beasts, their terror a feast for the emperor's delight. Ancient sources whisper that sometimes, when boredom struck him, he would order entire sections of the audience thrown into the arena, their only crime being that the seats were too empty and the spectacle too dull. Now pause and place yourself among that crowd. The sand is stained red. The cries of the dying pierce the air, and yet you cheer because silence would mark you as suspect. You force your voice to rise though your heart recoils, knowing that one wrong glance, one misplaced word, could send you from the stands to the arena floor. Survival meant complicity, and complicity meant carrying the weight of Rome's shame. Caligula's festivals spilled into the streets. There were days of drunken parades, nights of torchlit processions, and endless feasts where the emperor appeared dressed as gods, mocking traditions with every step. He demanded that noblewomen dance publicly, stripping them of their dignity, while senators were forced to serve as entertainers. The city became his stage, and every citizen his unwilling actor. But within the spectacle was strategy. Fear was not his only weapon. Exhaustion was another. By keeping Rome in a constant state of frenzy, he ensured that no one had the clarity or courage to resist. The city never rested, never reflected. It moved from one horror to another, its people numbed by excess and terror. Still in the shadows, resistance began to stir. Senators whispered of plots, generals questioned loyalty, and even the Praetorian Guard, sworn protectors of the emperor, began to grumble. The same men who once adored little boots now wondered whether Rome could survive him. And yet no one dared strike. For Caligula's power, though fragile in appearance, was reinforced by terror. Inside the palace, his private rituals grew darker. Guests spoke of feasts where he demanded not only their wives but their daughters. Fathers sat frozen, forced to smile as their families were paraded before the emperor's gaze. Each act of violation was not just a crime of passion. It was a calculated blow to Rome's pride. To break the family, the cornerstone of Roman virtue, was to break the empire itself. And here you must ask yourself, was Caligula's depravity the product of madness, or was it deliberate strategy? Was he a lunatic consumed by lust, or a tyrant who understood that to dominate Rome he must dominate its very soul? Ancient chroniclers leave us no certain answer, only fragments of horror that blur the line between fact and legend. The emperor's cruelty extended even to his own blood. His sisters, once companions of his revels, became pawns in his games. When rumors spread of plots against him, he turned on them with suspicion. Julia Livilla was exiled. Agrippina narrowly escaped death. and Drusilla, already deified, remained the ghostly shadow of his obsession. Family for Caligula was not sanctuary. It was just another stage for power. The more he demanded, the more Rome broke. Citizens who once filled the streets with celebration now walked in silence, their eyes lowered. Merchants feared to speak, priests feared to pray, senators feared to breathe. And yet, beneath the silence, rage simmered. Rome was a city suffocating, waiting for release. Now imagine being one of those senators, humiliated night after night, stripped of dignity, forced to endure rituals that mocked your ancestors' glory. You sit in the Curia, the Senate House, pretending to debate laws that no longer matter, while outside the palace devours your city. How long could you endure? How long before silence turned into action? The signs of collapse grew clearer. Caligula's coffers, once overflowing, began to empty under the weight of his extravagance. The games, the feasts, the temples all demanded gold, and the empire's treasury bled. Taxes increased, confiscations multiplied, and resentment spread. Soldiers grumbled at unpaid wages. Citizens cursed rising levies, and senators seethed as their fortunes were seized. A ruler may rule by fear, but hunger and poverty ignite fires that terror cannot smother. And yet Caligula continued, blind or indifferent to the consequences. He demanded ever grander projects, bridges of boats across bays, temples of impossible scale, feasts that devoured fortunes in a single night. Each demand was a monument not to Rome's glory, but to his own insatiable desire. The city groaned under the weight. Whispers turned to prayers, prayers to curses, curses to dangerous thoughts. And in those thoughts, knives began to take shape. For even Rome, with all its endurance, had limits. That night, the torches burned brighter than ever, their flames licking the marble walls of the Palatine. Inside, music echoed, laughter rang, and Caligula reveled in his theater of power. Outside, the streets lay silent, the citizens holding their breath, sensing that something was about to break, because in the heart of Rome, behind closed doors, men who had suffered too long, too deeply, were no longer whispering. They were planning. The marble streets of Rome gleamed beneath the winter sun, but behind their beauty, unrest was spreading like cracks in ancient stone. Caligula still paraded as a god, still demanded worship, still staged his nightly spectacles of humiliation and excess, but the empire had begun to whisper more boldly. Even those closest to him, soldiers sworn to defend, senators forced to bow, servants trained to silence, could no longer ignore the growing weight of his cruelty. The Praetorian Guard, once the unwavering shield of emperors, was restless. These elite soldiers had seen rulers come and go, but never one who mocked them so openly. Caligula's lavish spending had drained the treasury, and their promised rewards were late or absent. He insulted them in public, treating Rome's protectors as playthings, stripping away the respect they had always commanded. Loyalty built on honor and gold falters quickly when both are denied. Meanwhile, senators who had endured endless humiliations began to find one another in shadowed corners. Once they had been too afraid to speak, their voices smothered by fear. But now fear was joined by desperation. Their wives had been seized, their fortunes confiscated, their dignity reduced to ash. What more could they lose? In hushed tones, they remembered the days of Brutus and Cassius, when daggers had freed Rome from tyranny. Could it happen again? Could Rome rid itself of this living nightmare? Yet every plan was wrapped in danger. Caligula was unpredictable, suspicious, and surrounded by spies. Servants disappeared without explanation. Soldiers were executed on a whim, senators exiled or stripped of their titles. To conspire was to court death. And still the whispers grew. For when survival becomes unbearable, even death can seem a form of release. But Caligula remained oblivious or perhaps indifferent. He reveled in the spectacle of his power. One evening he declared himself Neptune, god of the sea, and ordered a procession to the shore. Thousands followed as he stood upon the sands, clad in shimmering armor. With dramatic flourish, he commanded his soldiers to march into the waves, collecting seashells as spoils of a great victory. The shells were carried back to Rome in triumph, presented as treasures, while the people watched in stunned silence. To Caligula it was theater. To Rome it was madness unveiled. Imagine the soldiers, hardened veterans of real battles, wading into the surf to gather shells while their emperor proclaimed conquest. Their hands, scarred from war, now held fragile trophies of absurdity. They obeyed, but their pride eroded with every step. For a soldier, ridicule cuts deeper than any wound, and yet ridicule was Caligula's weapon. He understood, or perhaps instinctively practiced, the art of degradation. By making Rome's greatest warriors, its most respected senators, its holiest priests participate in his madness, he stripped them of identity. He was not just destroying bodies, he was unmaking Rome itself. Still, even as fear reigned, anger grew. Citizens complained of hunger as taxes soared. Merchants groaned under confiscations. Farmers cursed the levies that stripped them of grain. Caligula, blind to their suffering, demanded more gold for his feasts, more treasures for his temples, more spectacles to feed his ego. The empire bled, and the people began to hate not just their emperor, but the silence that allowed him to reign. And you, had you lived then, what would you have done? Would you have joined the whispers in the Senate, the mutters in the barracks, the curses in the marketplace? Or would you have remained silent, praying the storm would pass, knowing that storms ruled by men rarely end without blood? The tension thickened like smoke before a fire. Senators found allies in unlikely places. Some of the praetorians, once guardians of the emperor, now listened more closely to whispers of revolt. To betray an emperor was unthinkable, but to endure him had become unbearable. Slowly, dangerously, lines were being drawn. Caligula, ever blinded by his own excess, staged yet another festival. This one was meant to surpass all others, a night of feasting, of games, of rituals so outrageous they would etch his name into eternity. Guests arrived in their finest robes, the palace glittering with jewels and gold. The air was thick with incense, the tables groaning under delicacies, the torches casting wild shadows across the walls. Musicians played, dancers swayed, and Caligula, crowned in gold, presided like a god upon his throne. But beneath the music, the guests felt it, the sharp edge of fear, the awareness that tonight might bring humiliation worse than any before. Husbands avoided their wives' eyes, senators clenched their fists beneath the table, soldiers stood rigid, their jaws tight. Every laugh rang hollow, every cheer forced. Rome was performing, but the performance was cracking. For in the shadows of that night, amid the laughter and the wine, some of those present were not simply enduring. They were watching, waiting, calculating. They studied the emperor's gestures, his guards' positions, the ebb and flow of the crowd. Every detail mattered, for if knives were ever to be drawn, timing would mean survival, and yet Caligula gave no sign of fear. He laughed, he sang, he mocked, his voice filling the hall with arrogance. He believed himself untouchable, a god among mortals. Perhaps he was right, for no mortal dared challenge him openly. But even gods, when they bleed, remind the world they are only men. The night stretched on, the torches burning low, the air heavy with tension. Guests clapped and smiled, but behind their eyes flickered the same thought. How much longer could this go on? How much longer could Rome bow before madness? The question lingered unspoken, hanging in the air like a blade waiting to fall. And outside the palace, in the cold night, Rome itself seemed to hold its breath. The city's stones, worn by centuries, had seen tyrants before. They had felt the weight of blood, the tremors of rebellion. Now they waited again, silent witnesses to the storm gathering within their walls. The torches flickered, the music swelled, and Caligula raised his cup high, proclaiming himself eternal. But even as the hall roared with forced applause, somewhere in the shadows, a hand tightened on a hidden dagger. The morning after Caligula's great festival, Rome stirred uneasily. The city's markets reopened, the forums filled with voices, but beneath the routine there was a weight that pressed on every heart. Those who had attended the night's revels carried more than hangovers. They carried the shame of forced laughter, the terror of humiliation, the bitter taste of complicity. Rome was bleeding dignity drop by drop, and the people knew it. Caligula awoke in his palace chambers triumphant, convinced that the night's excesses had once again proved his supremacy. He had paraded as a god, seized whomever he wished, and watched his city kneel before his madness. To him it was confirmation that he was untouchable, but outside the palace, whispers thickened like storm clouds. For every cheer he forced, 100 curses followed in silence. The emperor's extravagance had emptied the treasury, and the consequences were no longer confined to the elite. Farmers groaned under crushing taxes, Merchants cursed the confiscations of goods, and citizens muttered at the shortages of grain. Rome, the eternal city, had endured emperors before, but never one who so thoroughly devoured its lifeblood. Caligula demanded more, always more, until the empire itself seemed to stagger beneath his weight. The Praetorian Guard, his shield of steel, felt the strain as well. These men, loyal by oath and hardened by battle, were marked, unpaid, and dismissed as pawns in his games. Caligula had once been their darling, little Boots, the boy they adored in Germanicus's camp. But now many clenched their teeth in silence, their pride eroded with every insult. Soldiers can endure hunger, they can endure pain, but humiliation is a wound that festers, and in that festering silence, seeds of betrayal took root. Imagine a Praetorian standing guard at the palace gates. His spear is steady, his armor polished, but behind his eyes lies a storm. He watches senators pass, their faces pale, their wives avoiding every glance. He hears the laughter echoing from within, laughter that mocks him too, though he stands outside. He is sworn to defend the emperor, but what happens when the emperor becomes the enemy of Rome itself? Senators, too, reached their breaking point. The Curia was no longer a chamber of debate, but a stage for humiliation. Caligula arrived when he pleased, mocking their traditions, ridiculing their ancestors, stripping them of their dignity one cruel jest at a time. They sat in silence, their pride shattered, their fury smoldering. To endure was unbearable, but to act was deadly, and so they whispered, late at night in gardens, in secluded halls. Their words grew sharper, their plans bolder. For every man among them knew that if nothing changed, Rome itself might collapse under the weight of one man's madness. But Caligula seemed blind to the storm gathering around him. He believed himself immortal, divine, untouchable. He dressed as gods, demanded worship, staged spectacles of absurdity. One day he ordered the construction of a bridge of boats across the Bay of Baiae, commanding his soldiers to march across as if conquering the sea. The project drained resources, baffled generals, and humiliated men who had fought real wars. To Caligula it was theatre. To Rome it was madness given form, and yet his arrogance deepened. He threatened senators openly, mocked generals, seized fortunes, and desecrated traditions. He believed Rome could not touch him. Perhaps he was right, for the city trembled, the people bowed, and even his enemies played their parts in silence. But silence is never eternal. Beneath it lies the tremor of something inevitable, and you, had you been there, standing in the forum, hearing the whispers grow louder, feeling the unease thicken, would you have dared to believe change was coming? Or would you have silenced yourself once more, too fearful to hope? The whispers now found form. Among the senators, resentment hardened into resolve. Among the Praetorians, humiliation sharpened into anger. And within the palace, even those closest to Caligula began to weigh survival against loyalty. The emperor had mocked his guards once too often. He had stripped senators of wealth too recklessly. He had demanded worship too brazenly. The balance of power, so fragile, was shifting. Rome had endured much, but the time was nearing when endurance would no longer suffice. Caligula's arrogance continued to fuel the fire. At feasts he laughed of conspiracies, daring anyone to strike. He proclaimed himself eternal, invincible. To him, danger was a joke. To his enemies, it was a challenge. Each taunt, each insult, each outrage only sharpened the daggers hidden in shadows. The city itself seemed to sense it. The nights grew quieter. The torches burned lower, the air thick with unspoken anticipation. Rome, vast and eternal, had weathered tyrants before. Its stones had soaked blood, its walls had echoed with betrayal. Now once again the city braced itself for reckoning. Inside the palace, Caligula laughed oblivious. He believed the empire was his to toy with, his people his pawns, his soldiers his servants. But in the silence of Rome's streets, in the whispers of senators, in the clenched jaws of guards, the truth was forming. Gods may be feared, but men can be killed. And as the torches flickered on the Palatine Hill, shadows gathered not just in the corners of the palace, but in the hearts of those who had suffered too long. They no longer whispered of survival. They whispered of daggers. The Palatine Hill loomed above Rome, its marble halls gleaming by torchlight, but within those walls betrayal brewed. Caligula, draped in gold and intoxicated by power, believed himself eternal. He had paraded as gods, mocked the Senate, insulted the soldiers sworn to protect him. To the emperor, Rome was not a city, it was a stage. But even the grandest performance can end when the actors refuse to play their parts. The Praetorian Guard, his supposed shield, now carried more resentment than loyalty. Years of insults, missed payments, and public humiliation had eroded their devotion. To be a soldier under Caligula was not to be honored, but ridiculed. The same men who once adored little boots now muttered curses beneath their breath. And in their silence plots took form. Among the senators, anger burned hotter still. They had been stripped of wealth, robbed of dignity, forced to watch their wives and daughters paraded before the emperor's gaze. The Curia was no longer a house of law, but a stage for humiliation. Each insult had been a dagger driven into their pride, and now at last they began to consider answering insult with steel, but the risk was immense. To strike at an emperor was to gamble not only with one's life, but with the future of Rome itself. Fail, and the conspirators would be torn apart. Succeed, and the empire might yet be saved or thrown into chaos. Still, the whispers sharpened. They gathered in secret, voices low, eyes darting to every shadow. They spoke of Caligula's unpredictability, of his cruelty, of the danger he posed not only to the Senate, but to the empire as a whole. And at the center of these whispers stood Cassius Chaerea, a man few would have expected to defy an emperor. A Praetorian officer, Chaerea was not of great renown, not celebrated like the generals of old, but he carried his own wounds, wounds carved not by battle but by ridicule. Caligula, ever cruel, mocked him relentlessly, calling him names meant to strip him of manhood, taunting him with obscenities before his men. For a soldier, pride is as vital as breath, and Caligula had stolen his. Imagine Chaerea standing watch, his hand on the hilt of his sword, hearing the emperor's laughter echo through the halls. He had sworn to protect, yet every insult pressed heavier on his soul. Each taunt was a spark, until at last the sparks kindled into fire. In silence he began to listen, and what he heard was treason, but also salvation. The conspirators were not many, but they did not need numbers. They needed timing, precision, and the courage to strike where others feared. Senators lent their voices, but it was the Praetorian Guard who lent their steel. Plans were whispered by torchlight, adjusted in the shadows, guarded as though each word could mean death. They would wait for the right moment, when the emperor was vulnerable, when the theater of his power left him exposed. Meanwhile, Caligula reveled in his delusions. He staged processions, demanded worship, proclaimed himself Jupiter, Neptune, even Venus. He feasted until dawn, paraded through the city, turned temples into monuments to his ego. He laughed at the very idea of plots, mocking conspiracies as though daring them to exist. To him, danger was a joke, death an impossibility. He had forgotten the truth that even emperors bleed. And you, had you lived in those days, where would you have stood? Would you have whispered in the shadows with the conspirators, risking all for Rome's dignity? Or would you have remained silent, fearing that knives turned not on Caligula, but on those who dared to draw them? The city itself seemed to anticipate the storm. Omens filled the air. Strange lightning split the skies. Animals were born deformed. Priests whispered of angered gods. Superstition spread like fire, and many believed the heavens themselves cried out against Caligula. The people no longer cheered him in the streets. They watched in silence, eyes wary, lips pressed tight. Rome was waiting. The chosen moment approached. Her festival, a day of spectacle when the emperor would leave the safety of his chambers and walk among his people. Surrounded by musicians, dancers, and guards drunk on the performance, he would be distracted, vulnerable. The conspirators planned every detail, where they would stand, when they would strike, how the chaos would unfold. There would be no second chance. Chaerea prepared himself, not as a soldier going to battle, but as a man stepping into destiny. He knew the risk. He knew that if his blade faltered, his name would be forgotten in disgrace, his body fed to dogs. But if he succeeded, he would carve his place into history, not as a traitor, but as the man who ended Rome's nightmare. The day dawned with deceptive beauty. The sun gleamed on marble, the crowds gathered, the music swelled. Caligula, draped in brilliance, strode through the halls, laughing, mocking, drunk on the sound of his own divinity. The conspirators followed, their faces masks of obedience, their hands steady though their hearts raced. And then the moment came. A signal passed in silence, a glance exchanged, a hand tightening on a dagger's hilt. The air grew heavy, the laughter louder, the torches burning brighter, as though the city itself held its breath. Caligula walked into the passageway, surrounded by his men, blinded by arrogance, unaware that his final performance had already begun. Caligula stepped into the covered passage that linked the theatre to his private chambers, the air thick with incense and the echo of flutes fading behind him. The corridor was narrow, its walls veined with cool marble, its lamps casting trembling halos along the floor. He moved with the easy arrogance of a man who believed the world itself was an extension of his body. Behind him came attendants, musicians, a handful of praetorians too accustomed to spectacle to expect anything else, and among them, silent as a held breath, walked Cassius Chaerea. The officer's face betrayed nothing. His hand hovered near his sword belt, the leather warmed by his palm, the iron heavier than it had ever felt in battle. Caligula tossed a lazy glance over his shoulder, smirked, and kept walking. He had mocked Chaerea that morning, some obscene jest tossed like a coin to a beggar. Now the echo of that insult marched beside them. At a bend where the light failed and the lamplight pooled like oil, the procession bunched for a heartbeat. A dancer adjusted her anklet. A singer dabbed sweat from his brow. Somewhere a priest cleared his throat. Chaerea stepped closer. His voice, calm, almost courteous, cut through the corridor. "This is for the army." The blade flashed. It was not a grand sword stroke, not the swing of a hero from a triumphal arch. It was the efficient thrust of a soldier who had learned the quickest path through flesh and fate. Caligula's mouth opened in disbelief before sound returned to the world. Another blade found ribs. Another tore silk. Panic erupted like a furnace unlatched. The emperor, the god, the mocker of men, staggered backward, a spray of crimson stippling marble like falling poppies. He tried to speak, perhaps to order, perhaps to curse, but the corridor drowned his words in the clatter of sandals, the hiss of steel, the gasp of courtiers discovering terror's true form. Imagine the smell, the sudden iron bloom of blood, the oiled leather of scabbards, the hot breath of men realizing the boundary between life and legend has cracked. In that instant you are both witness and accomplice, a Roman in the wrong corridor on the right day, heartbeat hammering at your ribs while history writes in strokes you will never forget. Would you run? Would you kneel? Or would you stare, unable to wrench your eyes from the vision of a man once called divine collapsing into something devastatingly human? He fell not like a god struck from the sky, but like any man whose body has forgotten the bargain with breath. The attendants screamed. One guard lunged and was cut down. A musician, poor fool, threw his lyre like a shield. The strings snapped with a sound too thin for so much fear. Chaerea struck again, as did others whose names would blur in the retellings. Blades from men who had been cheated of pay, dignity, sons, sleep. Suetonius later claimed the emperor cried for his mother. Others said he tried to flee under a curtain, and tangled in purple like a net. Ancient writers disagree on the precise last word, but agree on the scene's obscene intimacy. No battlefield trumpet, no funeral oration, only the huff of lungs, the stick of blood under sandals, the thud of a body meeting stone, and then silence, the kind that makes torches sound loud. Caligula lay still, the gold diadem tilted as if in a final jest. The assassins stood in the buzzing quiet of their own courage, men who had been smaller than the emperor a moment ago, and were now, impossibly, larger than his broken shadow. For a heartbeat, the corridor seemed to widen, as though Rome itself had inhaled. Then the world crashed back, shouts ahead and behind, the clatter of armor, the stampede of rumors sprinting faster than feet. You may think this is where fear ends, that a tyrant's death frees the city in one clean cut. But ask yourself, when power is severed from a living body, where does it go? Does it vanish like breath in winter? Or does it rush into every open space, filling them with fire? In that echoing passage, power did not die. It multiplied. Every man there now held a fragment hot enough to burn him alive. The conspirators had planned a strike. They had not planned the avalanche that followed. Some ran to secure the theatre. Others sought the Praetorian barracks, needing at once to claim credit and forgiveness. A few dragged the emperor's body aside, their hands sticky, their eyes glassed, as if death itself needed room to move. From the far end of the corridor, the Empress Caesonia's voice rose, confusion, then horror, followed by a child's cry. Caligula's little daughter had been nearby, a living thread in a tapestry suddenly on fire. Sources differ on the sequence that followed. Some say the assassins moved quickly, slaughtering any branch of the imperial tree that might sprout anew. Others insist the chaos swallowed even their intentions, that panic and vengeance outpaced decision. What is certain is that innocence that day found no sanctuary in halls that had long ago expelled mercy. Outside, the crowd sensed fracture before it understood cause. Musicians faltered. Murmurs rippled the air like wind across wheat. Courtiers looked to one another, with the faces of gamblers who have forgotten the rules of the game. News took on bodies. First a rumor sprinting, then a whisper grabbing wrists, then a shout crashing into pillars. The Emperor is dead. People do not believe such words the first time. The world has an inertia that resists sudden truth. But when men with blood on their tunics do not deny it, when a senator runs, when a guard drops to his knees and sobs, belief hardens into terror. Imagine standing in that theater's colonnade, watching panic ignite from one pair of eyes to the next. Do you flee toward home, hugging walls as if stone can keep you safe? Do you stand frozen, as though stillness might make you invisible? Or do you, like a few, grin without meaning to, fear and relief wrestling in your face until both feel like sin? Inside the palace, power scrambled for purchase. Some praetorians rallied to the assassins, not out of ideology but exhaustion. Others, stunned, demanded names, orders, explanations. A handful hunted blind through corridors for anyone who could tell them who they were, now that their emperor was a corpse cooling in shadow. In one chamber, a cluster of senators argued over what to call the future. Restored republic or managed monarchy, each man hearing his own ambition as destiny. But ambition is loudest in the hour of blood, and the gods love to watch it slip. Claudius, uncle to the dead emperor, had not been counted among the bold or the dangerous. Stammering scholarly, mocked by his family, he had survived the reign by appearing smaller than a threat. Now as the palace shook, he hid behind a curtain. Tacitus would later write of him found trembling among draperies, the image of a man camouflaged by fear. A praetorian pulled the fabric aside, sword ready. The two stared, the soldier seeing not a scholar but a possibility. A body that could wear purple, a name that could pay wages. In that heartbeat the empire's vector kinked. A life spared became a throne offered. A reflex of mercy became a bargain written in iron. And you must consider it. If you were that soldier, blood sticky on your knuckles, fear chewing your gut, would you reach for an ideal, Senate, Republic, liberty, or for a man who could sign orders and double your pay? Theories thrill the educated. Hunger persuades the armed. The assassins fanned into daylight, some with faces set like stone, others blinking at what they had done. They expected the city to rise in gratitude. It did not. Gratitude is a luxury, and Rome had no coin for it that day. Instead came the rattle of barracks' gates, the drum of boots, the low-growing howl of a force coalescing around a different truth. An emperor had been killed, and someone must pay. Perhaps not the guilty, perhaps only the closest. Crowds, like rivers, do not choose their victims with precision. The first screams outside the theater were not rhetorical. A few courtiers were cut down where they stood. A cowering servant, his tunic spattered, tried to explain himself to men who wanted only a target that could bleed. The fear that had lived in Rome like smoke found flame and food. The praetorians, their pride insulted by years of mockery, and now by a conspiracy that had not consulted them as equal partners, surged. Some swore vengeance for the emperor. Others swore vengeance for the chaos. Vengeance cares little for its grammar, only for its verb. And you, trying to flee that square, would have learned how wide the empire's shadow could stretch. Doors slammed. Vendors hid their scales. Mothers pulled children into alley mouths dark as wells. You turned a corner and nearly stepped on a dropped wreath, trampled into pulp. You inhaled and tasted the metal tang that makes memory permanent. You listened, and the city had become a forest with predators, each roar a command, each silence a trap. The Senate, in urgent debate, dared to imagine the Republic reborn, as if time could be persuaded to walk backward. Some argued to proclaim liberty. Others, remembering the last time daggers met a dictator, remembered also the wars that followed. The city's stones keep the sound of civil war in their pores. Perhaps the senators could hear it rising. Even as they spoke, News reached them of the praetorians lifting Claudius on their shoulders, hailing an emperor others had not yet imagined. The guard that had failed to protect Caligula now discovered it could protect the idea of the throne itself, and sell that protection for a price. In the alleys behind the palace, lesser tragedies unfolded with no historian to record them. A young trumpeter, his instrument dented, crouched behind amphorae, whispering a prayer he barely remembered. A maid, whose job had been to light lamps, in a hallway now sticky with more than oil, scrubbed at a stain as if she could undo a fact with enough elbow. A boy, running messages for a senator who would not survive sunset, learned that breath can be a debt and that sometimes the body refuses to pay. Empires write their headlines in marble, the margins are written in salt water. And still the question spread like a rumor with knives. Who ruled Rome now? The gods did not answer. The crowd did in fragments. Some demanded the conspirators' heads before they had names. Some begged the guard to restore calm, which is to say, to restore a master. Others, fewer, quieter, looked to the capital and imagined a world where purple never again turned men into monsters. But imagination is fragile when swords are arguing nearby. Chaerea moved among his men with a composure that surprised even himself. He had done the impossible and found it possible. Yet the shape of the city's response unsettled him. He had counted on the guards' resentment. He had counted on the Senate's hunger. He had not counted on the ancient reflex of Rome's streets, fear bent toward order. Any order. In the distance the chant began, uncertain at first, then growing, as more throats joined in not from devotion but from the gravity that pulls crowds to centers of force. A name rolled like a drumbeat. Claudius. In a small chapel near the palace, a priest lit new incense while the old still smoked, a foolishness that made the air so thick it hurt to breathe. He murmured prayers to gods who had been replaced and restored and replaced again in these very rooms. He wondered which name to speak, and decided that in confusion all names were safer than one. Outside, a squad of soldiers thundered past, their sandals slapping stone with a promise of decision. What do you do when a monster is slain and the city remains afraid? Do you cheer knowing your shout might be heard by the wrong ears? Do you hide knowing history rarely writes down the names of the wise who duck? Or do you, like a few mad or holy souls, walk toward the barracks and try to barter truth with men who are sharpening reality on whetstones? By afternoon, the palace looked like the aftermath of a storm that had learned how to use knives. Tapestries sagged. A goblet lay on its side, wine pooling into a shape that looked almost like a map of an empire that had just split. A pair of sandals, gold-laced and abandoned, waited near a threshold as if the feet would return for them. They would not. In a side chamber, a woman's bracelet glittered beside a smear no one wished to name. The splendor did not argue with the horror, it framed it. That is what palaces do. Whispers about Cisonia and the child crackled through the corridors, each version worse than the last. Some claimed mercy, others insisted on brutality. Ancient writers disagree, perhaps because even rumor flinched at speaking plainly. The empire's next hour demanded symbols, and there is no symbol the fearful love more than a bloodline ending. Rome that day paid for its faith in theater with a finale it could never agree on. Toward dusk, the praetorians sealed the palace gates and raised their standards, as much to calm themselves as the crowd. Word pulsed outward that Claudius had been acclaimed by the guard. The Senate fumed, then faltered. Citizens calculated, as citizens do, which doorway to stand in so they might be nearest to the future when it passed. Caligula lay where he had fallen or where he had been dragged. Even that detail dissolved into argument as quickly as blood into dust. Somewhere a scribe began a list of names for exile or execution, leaving spaces blank where vengeance would later decide vowels. And you, standing at the edge of the forum as torches pricked the violet sky, felt it, the strange quiet that follows. A scream, the hush in which even your own breath sounds disloyal. The city had killed a god and found itself more human than it could bear. It turned its face toward the barracks because the barracks had a chorus and the Senate had only a quarrel. A soldier shouted an order, 100 boots answered. That, for the moment, was Rome's definition of peace. Night settled. The stars looked down like cold witnesses, unchanged by a man's unmaking. Somewhere in the palace a door creaked on its hinge, the sound too ordinary for a day so murderous, which is why it lodged in memory. A dog barked and was silenced. Dad a trumpet blew a single uncertain note, and thought better of the second. In a cellar, wine seeped from a cracked amphora, dark and patient. History would later argue whether Caligula's death saved Rome or merely rearranged its furniture. But history was not there to carry the bodies, or to choose which lie to tell a frightened child about why the streets smelled of smoke. That night belonged to men with swords and men with ledgers, and the thin, thready courage of people who decide to live until dawn, no matter who wears the laurel at sunrise. And at the very edge of the Palatine, where the hill folds into shadow, a figure watched the barracks' torches gather like a constellation being born. He wiped his blade on cloth, and did not look back at the corridor where an emperor had learned how quickly a god can fall. He listened to the chant swelling, felt the city pivot on a single word, and understood that the cut he had made had not closed anything. It had opened something vast. He sheathed his sword and heard footsteps behind him that did not belong to a friend. The city of Rome did not sleep the night after Caligula's fall. Torches flickered in every district, casting restless shadows across marble facades. Citizens whispered in doorways, soldiers prowled the streets, and senators huddled in urgent debate. The emperor who had declared himself divine now lay dead, and yet the air was thicker with fear than with relief. Rome had slain a monster, but in doing so it had opened a void, and nature, especially political nature, abhors a vacuum. The Praetorian Guard moved swiftly to fill it. They had been Caligula's tormentors and protectors in equal measure, humiliated by his mockery, yet bound by oath. When his body fell, so too did their certainty. For a brief moment the guard was unmoored, but soldiers do not linger in uncertainty. They act, and in Claudius, trembling behind a curtain, they found a solution both convenient and profitable. Dragged into the open, the awkward uncle of the slain emperor must have looked more like prey than power. His stammer, his limp, his lifetime of mockery had convinced many that Claudius was harmless. Yet that very harmlessness made him perfect. The guard could mold him, control him, present him as stability while ensuring their own supremacy. And so, beneath the shadow of the barracks, Claudius was lifted onto their shoulders, hailed as imperator. His voice quivered, his hands shook, but the purple found its new bearer. Imagine the scene, senators still locked in argument about restoring the republic, their voices rising in hope and desperation. Then comes the news. Claudius has been acclaimed by the guard. The Senate's words curdle in their throats. They can argue ideals, but ideals do not march with shields and spears. The streets answer not to debate but to boots. Rome has chosen its emperor, not through law or tradition, but through the raw calculus of power. The conspirators, meanwhile, faced their own reckoning. Cassius Chaerea, whose blade had first struck, expected gratitude. He believed the Senate would honor him, that Rome would see him as liberator. Instead, he was met with suspicion, even betrayal. For to kill a tyrant is not to end tyranny. It is to remind Rome how fragile the throne truly is. And fragility terrifies those who benefit from order. Chaerea, once the hand that freed the empire, was soon branded a murderer. Justice, like empire, is often a mask worn by necessity. And here you must ask yourself, would you have taken that blade in your hand, knowing the city you saved might condemn you? Would you have risked everything, not for glory, but for the chance that history might misunderstand you forever? Rome did not mourn Caligula. The streets were not filled with grief, but with relief edged in fear. The people spoke of omens fulfilled, of gods avenged. Priests whispered that Jupiter had struck down a false rival. Yet even as curses faded, uncertainty grew, for Caligula's reign had revealed something the city could not forget, that the purple robe could transform a man into something monstrous, and that no law, no tradition, no god could shield Rome from the madness of one ruler. Claudius worked quickly to restore calm. He granted amnesty, distributed coin, promised stability. He knew his position was fragile, propped up by the guard, tolerated by the Senate, untested by the people. Every decree was both reassurance and plea. But behind his careful words lurked the shadow of his nephew. Caligula's ghost haunted every chamber, every forum, every whisper. Rome could remove the man, but not the memory, and memory once born cannot be killed. The stories of Caligula's rituals spread further in death than they ever had in life. Ancient writers, freed from fear, painted his reign in strokes of horror. They wrote of feasts where nobility was mocked, of incest whispered, of seashells paraded as spoils, of nights so obscene that words faltered. Some details blurred into exaggeration, some were sharpened into symbols, but all carried the same truth. Rome had lived under a reign where fear replaced law, where humiliation replaced governance, where the emperor's will was the only measure of reality. Imagine sitting by a fire decades later, listening to elders recount those days. Their voices drop, their eyes shift to shadows as though even memory might summon his ghost. You hear of the night he was struck down, of the corridor slick with blood, of the shouts and chaos that followed. And you wonder, not whether it happened, but whether it could happen again. For Caligula's reign is not only a story of one man's madness, it is a story of power itself. Absolute power does not need reason to corrupt. It corrodes by its very nature. Rome learned this lesson bitterly, and the lesson has echoed ever since, and so we return to you. Picture yourself in that corridor, the blade flashing, the emperor falling, or in the Senate, your dignity stolen night after night, or in the crowd, forced to cheer while your heart rebelled. What would you have done? Would you have raised the dagger or bowed your head? Would you have endured for survival, or risked everything for Rome? These are not questions confined to marble and torchlight. They are questions that outlive empires, because history is not merely the record of what happened. It is the echo of choices made by those who dared, and those who did not. Caligula's name still chills the spine, not simply because of his deeds, but because his story forces us to confront our own. How much corruption would we endure? How much humiliation would we suffer before breaking? And when that moment came, would we choose silence or steel? The torches of Rome have long since burned out, the marble cracked, the palaces reduced to ruin. But the shadow of Caligula lingers. It lingers in every question about power unchecked, in every whisper of tyranny reborn, in every silence that trembles before authority. And so, as we close this descent into the darkest chambers of Rome, we leave you with this. Was Caligula merely a madman? Or was he the inevitable product of power unrestrained? Tell us in the comments what you believe. Was Rome ruled by insanity or by the mirror it dared not face? Because some stories were never meant to stay buried. Don't let them vanish. Keep them alive with us here at Secret Historians.